In observance of Peace Officers Memorial Day, a part of National Police Week, the National Peace Officers Memorial Service took place earlier today at the west front of the United States Capitol. The breakdown of law and order throughout this decade has led to skyrocketing crime, with many American cities just overrun. So far this year, 58 officers have died in the line of duty. Last year it was over 280. Now, in response, House Republicans will bring pro-law enforcement legislation to the floor this week, highlighting GOP priorities in this election, showing a stark contrast between them and the president and his party. Joining me now to discuss this is Jason Johnson, president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. He previously served as the deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department. Jason, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Good to be with you, Tony.
So give us your thoughts on the state of law enforcement. We're a couple years away from the big push for the defund law enforcement. Has the reality of that settled in on many of these blue cities that all of a sudden are maybe finding a new desire to have stronger law enforcement departments?
Yeah, I think we have started to see some cities turn a corner. Some of the prosecutors that have been elected that we call collectively progressive prosecutors or pro-criminal prosecutors that were elected solely for the purpose of finding ways to help people who are actually engaged in criminal activity avoid accountability, certainly avoid incarceration, and those prosecutors have shifted their focus to law enforcement and regulating law enforcement and punishing law enforcement officers in some cases just for doing their jobs. I think we've started to see a little bit of ebb in that. We've seen some of these prosecutors lose their bids at re-election. We've seen some removed by governors, as Governor DeSantis has removed a couple of those prosecutors in Florida. But it does persist, and there are some cities that still have these progressive prosecutors, and new cities are electing them. And so I think we have seen some improvement since 2020, and I think that is shown in the crime numbers. Although crime is very high, some categories of violent crime have begun to stabilize, like homicides and non-fatal shootings in many cities have stabilized or actually have started to come down a little bit.
Jason, let's talk about the long-term effects. Let's say some of these cities that continue to be kind of anti-law enforcement. If you're in that department, you're not going to be really happy about being there when you know the administration doesn't have your back. And what's the long-term effect that that's going to have on many of these departments and the community?
Well, I think that we are seeing the phenomenon that you described play out in the form of a real recruiting crisis and a staffing crisis in law enforcement. Just about every law enforcement agency in our country is grossly understaffed. The problem is worse in bigger and bluer cities, where, as you sort of indicate in the question, that young people who are interested in a career in law enforcement may be less interested in serving in a city where there's a higher likelihood of them being sued or prosecuted or really treated poorly, as some cities have begun treating their law enforcement officers. And those same young people who might be excellent candidates to be police officers would instead serve in a suburban or more rural community where they would be more appreciated, more protected, less likely to be mistreated or prosecuted. And so I think we are seeing that. That is happening right now. And in some cities like Baltimore, where I'm most familiar, the staffing levels have reached a crisis. And Baltimore is not alone in that regard.
Well,
I think
Baltimore was already a volatile city. And you add this to the mix, and I mean, it's the residents that suffer.
Well, that's exactly right, Tony. In fact, sometimes in the rhetoric that we hear, particularly coming from the left side of the political spectrum, that there is that urban Black citizens don't want law enforcement. They want law enforcement to be defunded. They don't think that policing reduces crime. Actually, if you're on the ground in a city like Baltimore and just about any other city I'm familiar with, you'll find that Black residents that live in the communities that are most impacted by crime actually want more police. And the polling data backs us up on that. And so
Well,
it's really more white progressives that are fighting back against more police. The black residents in the city's areas most affected by crime want more police.
I can testify to that as a former police officer working in those communities. They were always happy to see us there. Very quickly, we're just about out of time, but I was reading the AP this morning, and on this day when we mark Law Enforcement Day, memorial for peace officers, they're advocating for nationalization, federalization, more government, federal government oversight. At a time when we see at the federal level the weaponization, that's not the direction we should be going, is it?
Oh, not at all. And in fact, the efforts that we've seen so far at federalization or increased federal oversight of local law enforcement is in the form of these consent decrees that actually really negatively impact the ability of law enforcement to serve their communities in the cities in which consent decrees exist. And these consent decrees in cities like Chicago and Baltimore and Seattle and New Orleans and still others that the current administration wants to expand to um, have increased crime, have
Yeah.
reduced the staffing of police departments, and have really encumbered law enforcement officers and agencies from serving.
The local community knows best in most cases. Jason, we're out of time, but always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks for your service.
Thank you so much.